Hello and welcome to the Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast. My name is Stephen Cole, and I am delighted today to be joined by Karim Elgendy. Mr. Elgendy is an urban sustainability and climate consultant based in London with more than 2 decades of experience. His areas of expertise include developing sustainable and resilient cities and neighbourhoods, climate policy analysis, and energy transition. His current work focuses on the Middle East and North Africa region, especially around the Eastern Mediterranean and the Gulf. But his 20 years of experience spans Europe, North America, and sub-Saharan Africa. Karim, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you for inviting me to the podcast. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
That's lovely. Well, let's start with a very broad question. Is the debate over climate change affecting policy, especially over fossil fuel consumption? And that in turn, is it affecting policy at governmental level in the MWA area?
Sure. So let me preface this by saying that climate change is seen first and foremost in the region from a climate adaptation and a climate justice angle, not from a emissions angle. The region is particularly at risk from climate impacts in a way that is disproportionate to its share of the global economy, disproportionate to its share of the global population, and far more disproportionate to its historic responsibility for those emissions. So the region looks at the emissions issue as not really its own making, and therefore the framing of it is different. The region is warming at the fastest rate of any inhabited region in the world, and only second to the Arctic. So naturally, this very framing limits the impact of climate change as an issue and mitigation actions on energy policy and other policies in the region. Also, the region has many other crises. So the climate crisis has to find bandwidth within policymakers of the region and to kind of compete with other poly crises that the region is facing.
I see. That's interesting. It needs to find its place on the agenda, which is obviously quite a busy agenda. Do the policy differences vary much between the various MWA countries? For example, are there real policy differences between fossil fuel rich and fossil fuel poor countries?
The fossil fuel importers, the energy poor parts of the region, look at the energy transition in general and climate mitigation action as a way of improving their very energy security. They're always dependent on importing fossil fuels. So if they can reduce that dependence by building their renewable energy facilities, solar and wind, they can perhaps become more energy secure. And the other thing is that most of the financing today is directed towards those new energy sources, and they're less available for fossil fuel energy sources and electricity generation projects. So as these countries, which are often cash-strapped, seek financing for projects, they're often directed in that direction anyways. On the other hand, the fossil fuel exporters, they're seeing the energy transition in quite a different way, actually. They see that as an attempt to diversify their economies, decarbonize their economies, and make more fossil fuel available for exports. So if they use less renewable and less fossil fuel internally, for example, Saudi Arabia aims to become 50% dependent on renewables for its electricity, that releases a lot more of its fossil fuels for exportation before the world no longer needs it.
So what is driving policy changes? What I mean by that is it the comparative differences between fuels and the cost of efficiency measures, a need to tackle climate change by transition away from fossil fuels, or is it a need to put into place climate change abatement measures? Which one?
In many cases, it is economics, really. I mean, the cost of efficiency measures that you mentioned, the risk of the rising cost of electricity in parts of the region following the increase in cost of fuels that we had seen, specifically in the Gulf, and also the availability of new finance mechanisms known as the energy service companies or long-term financing for efficiency. They've all made energy efficiency somewhat more appealing. However, what has become more appealing is the advent, the rise, the meteoric rise, really, of renewable energy projects, specifically at large scale compared to, say, rooftop renewable energy projects. And that rise of renewable energy in the region has made renewables the cheapest form of adding new electricity generation, new generation capacity in the region. Some would even...
Yeah, carry on. That's interesting about that.
So today, if you want to add electricity to your grid to meet population demand, increasing quality of life, the cheapest way to do that would be to add renewable energy capacity to your grid, not to add fossil fuel generation, not to add another gas-fired power plant, but to add a new solar power plant. And there's a limit to that in terms of the cost. But the continuous drop in the cost of renewables and the cost of batteries mean that by 2027, so in 2 years' time, solar plus batteries will be cheaper than any form of electricity in the region.
Now, we see that Doha is the newest member of the UNESCO Global Network of Learning Cities. What key challenges do cities face today in achieving urban sustainability?
Sure. So the cities in general are the greatest thing that humans have ever made, and they carry this promise that they're going to provide us with amazing efficiency and economic efficiency, but also environmental efficiency. But today, cities around the world are trying to transition in a way that it becomes more sustainable to reduce what we call their metabolism. Their dependence on resources like energy, water, and materials that go into the city, and reduce the waste that they generate. And these wastes would include solid waste, wastewater, but also carbon emissions. So this metabolism, this process of eating in resources and spitting out things that you no longer need, has become too intense, and it's eating up the global resources.
So are these challenges worldwide? Are they global, or do Middle Eastern cities have particular challenges?
They are global, but Middle Eastern cities no longer hold that promise I just mentioned. Middle Eastern cities are dysfunctional to an extent where the environmental benefits, this efficiency that I mentioned, the environmental efficiency of using less resources than perhaps rural lifestyle, are no longer there. In a way, urbanism didn't really provide the benefits that it should have provided or could have provided in the context of the Middle East. And there are fundamental challenges behind that. The cities of the region are very low density, which means that you can't walk, you can't use public transportation in a way that is economically viable. The cities are car dependent. There is no good transportation networks to start with. The building stock is really poor. It's not designed in harmony with this environment. It uses too many inefficient air conditioning systems. There isn't enough water, so they're dependent on desalination, which is inefficient, and it uses a lot of energy resources and results in emissions. And of course, the cities have a rising carbon emission footprint, which bucks the trend of the global trend of reducing emissions in cities.
I mean, that's a problem rarely mentioned, isn't it? Sort of the actual management of utilities, water, electricity, gas. And the competence of the management of those utilities.
Absolutely. It isn't just an operational issue. It's also the sources of energy and the sources of water that those cities find themselves dependent on. If there isn't enough water, if the city has grown large enough and it's expecting to use more resources, then it transitions away from what was sustainable water resources, say groundwater, into desalination, and that desalination technology might not necessarily be the most environmentally friendly.
We note that in many fossil-rich capitals, the cost of energy is cheap, either through subsidies or because the marginal cost of fuel is intrinsically low. How can the energy transition be progressed in cities in that case? Would you advocate something like energy or carbon taxes?
Well, I put it in a different way. The low cost of fuel in the region is actually a form of subsidy, because there is a lost opportunity of exporting that fuel at a much higher rate globally. So if you sell it at a much lower rate domestically, then that is a form of subsidy. And that subsidy in and of itself, I mean, let's not deceive ourselves about this, is a form of a social contract, and it goes with other parts of the social contract in those countries. Unfortunately, this particular form of subsidies is, in my opinion, quite regressive. And the reason I say that is because it subsidizes the more affluent rather than those who are less affluent. The more cars you have, the more fuel you could consume, the more subsidy you get from the government. And the less cars you have, the less consumption and the less subsidy you get from the government. So in a way, it subsidizes the rich rather than the other way around. And it is estimated globally that those forms of subsidies, as well as direct subsidies to fossil fuels, rise up to about 7 trillion every year. And if renewables are to advance further, not just become the cheapest form of new energy, but even become cheaper than existing forms of energy, then we need a more level playing field.
Not long ago, I went to Barcelona to investigate the so-called 15-minute city, which is prevalent on the high on the planning list in Barcelona. It's an urban planning concept, you're aware of that, where neighbourhoods give residents everything they need: shops, schools, parks, healthcare within 15-minute radius by foot or bike. Is that a good example of a city or a neighbourhood that has successfully implemented sustainable urban strategies? Is the 15-minute city, is it happening?
Of course, it is happening. It's happening in Paris, where it started. It's also happening in Barcelona. But let's not limit it to those cities that already have an existing strong public transportation network and that can have the basis for walkability. There are other parts of the world that have implemented successful measures in Latin America and even in the Middle East. I would even say that parts of Doha, the Musharraf district, has implemented a good sustainable urban planning strategies in its planning. It had become walkable, it had become integrated into public transportation, and it has provided a quality of life where a lot of amenities are available compared to many other parts of the city. It sets a good model for urban regeneration, not citywide, but within a certain contained district of the city.
How can urban greening initiatives contribute to climate resilience? I mean, are major greening initiatives possible in Middle Eastern cities? I know you like the area in Doha, but elsewhere?
Well, greening is different. So greening is part of what we call nature-based solutions, the use of nature to make a city more resilient. And what we mean by resilient is not quite the same as sustainable. It's an ability of city to respond to shocks and stresses and continue to operate and even thrive. And when we talk about resilience in the context of greening, what we talk about is reducing mostly thermal heat shocks that can happen in the city. Basically, the city's ability to continue to operate despite a heat wave, for example, or in other cases, despite a rising sea level, or despite a very intense storm or a flooding event that could face this particular city. And greening is critical in that respect. It does all of the above. It deals very well with outdoor comfort, improves outdoor comfort, it regulates humidity and temperature, provides shade.
Karim, just to interrupt you, I mean, tell us what greening is. Does it mean planting trees? Is that it?
It does. Yeah, it does. Increasing vegetation, planting trees, providing open spaces. It is every form of vegetation, be that on a roof of a building, one pot on the street, large park, even afforestation in some climates. So the urban greening as a principle can provide a network that improves climate, manages stormwater much better, even deals in some places with rising sea level. So I would say the urban greening, if we can find the water for it in a sustainable way, and I would put Doha as a good example for that because it uses treated sewage in order to recycle treated sewage and use it for irrigation. If done well and the water is sourced sustainably, like in the case of Doha, then it can become a great tool in our tool set for managing urban resilience.
What then are the most effective measures cities can adopt to mitigate the impacts of extreme weather events? I mean, we saw some amazing pictures in Dubai, didn't we, of the flooding there, sudden rainfall, huge volumes. So how do you mitigate the impacts of those?
By nature-based solutions, actually. I would say that the issue that we had faced in Dubai was increasing concreting over everything, and that meant that the water had nowhere to go. And the
solution, the drains of sand would also help, of course.
It might do, but you don't need the drains if the ground is permeable, right? If most of the ground is permeable because of vegetation or because there's soil, I think that really contributes a lot more than what we call gray infrastructure. So there's a comparison here by using green infrastructure, which provides stormwater management required, but also provides amenity, social benefits, psychological benefits, improves outdoor comfort, as well as dealing with the stormwater. But they can also be much cheaper than a gray infrastructure, which is drains and culverts and other concrete and pipe-based solutions.
Like most efforts, everything comes back to money and economies. How do coastal cities balance economic growth with climate resilience efforts?
I take it what you mean by coastal here is that it is at risk from sea level. I would say,
yeah,
there are a number of ways to deal with the impending sea level rise. So what we're basically looking at is 1 meter of sea level rise by the end of the century, maybe by 2080. If something unexpected or a potential event that may or may not happen, which is the melting of, or the beginning of the melting of Greenland, if that starts happening, then we're looking at 2 meters of sea level rise. In both cases, we have multiple solutions. We either retreat, right? We build walls around the city, or we find ways in which we allow the cities, the water to come in certain ways and not and use the dredged land to build up defenses in other places. So there are nature-based solutions for that, like mangroves and other forms of planting that could mitigate some of this and reduce the storm surges that can come and worsen this. But in general, sea level rise is a real threat for coastal cities. And when you say managing economic development, I take it you mean the constant desire to build right up on the coast. And if we don't do that, then if we don't manage our coastal developments, current and future coastal developments, by taking into account this inevitable sea level rise, at least 1 meter of sea level rise, then we're building stranded assets.
So, what strategies could be employed to retrofit older urban areas where a lot of the infrastructure is past its prime or seen better days to make them more climate resilient? And this is a problem for many of the older cities in the world.
It is very difficult. Urban regeneration, there's a good reason why it doesn't happen that much, right? It's because it's incredibly difficult. And for developers, it's much easier, much more straightforward to find land outside of the city or elsewhere in the city and develop it, rather than having to deal with those basic infrastructure issues, with the upgrades that it requires, and also the other constraints that come with developing a city center location. And the larger the scale this is, the longer it will take. So, for example, going back to the Musharrab or the development in downtown Beirut, those projects took better part of a decade for them to complete, and that's certainly a concern economically. But from a sustainability perspective, the prize of reviving a city center is great. So if we can muster the will and the finances that are required to develop a city center, then we can end up with cities that are more sustainable in the long term, and that can also maintain a character for the continuity of the identity of the city.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. The character is very important. If you lose that, you start to lose the city centre, don't you? But how would you describe the key elements of a successful climate policy at city level?
I would say it's one that starts from the city. In many cases, if we're talking about the Middle East and North Africa, what we see is lack of competence and also lack of powers by the city authorities in order to carry out climate policies at city level. So if the cities want to carry out climate policy or energy policy that relates to energy transition, then they need to be empowered to do that. And they also need to have consensus from all the different stakeholders. Community engagement is critical. What we see is top-down national level policies implemented at different districts, different governorates in some cases. But by and large, it isn't from the city, so it often fails to capture the nuances that the city requires, and certainly does not engage with the scale of the community itself.
So how can cities balance energy transition goals with equity and affordability considerations? Because this is the big balance.
It isn't really a city issue. It is mostly a national level issue. Energy policy tends to be a national level kind of policy. However, cities can mitigate some of that, or can address some of that by, in some locations, attempting to create decentralized energy grids, community level energy grids that support perhaps remote areas, or support areas that can use rooftop solar or other forms of waste to energy plants to support itself from an energy security perspective. And that would improve equity, and that would improve resilience at the same time. Now, there are practical issues as to how they would do that in the context of the state or the national policies. But if it is done, it will certainly support the cities in their own local endeavors to implement sustainability measures.
And what advice would you give to people trying to bring together government, private sector, and communities to try and enhance their climate adaptation efforts?
It's a difficult one because the private sector doesn't really care much about climate adaptation because there's no money in it. It is mostly a national, it's mostly a state issue. So the state, it's including national governments and city governments, if available, local authorities, if available, are the ones that determine their climate adaptation policies, and they are the ones who try and find finance for that. So issues such as increasing heat waves, or reducing precipitation and the need for more water for agriculture, or sea level rise, for example, such as in the delta of the Nile in Egypt, all of those issues that the private sector doesn't really find profitable. So it's really hard for us to envisage a scenario where the private sector engages with the government on that.
Well, Karim, that question concludes our interview. On behalf of the Al-Attiyah Foundation, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today and giving our listeners your valuable insights on technology and the political developments in the GCC. The Foundation very much looks forward to continuing our conversation with you very soon.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for having me.
Not at all. And thank you for listening. A new Al-Attiyah Foundation podcast will be released in the coming weeks, so be sure to check our website and the social media pages. But for now, from me, Stephen Cole, goodbye.